My parents chose my sister over me, and it backfired spectacularly. My parents chose my sister over me, and let me tell you, it backfired spectacularly. I am a 30-year-old guy, and for as long as I can remember, I've always felt like the odd one out in my family. My younger sister, Emily, who is 28 now, has been the golden child since day one. I used to think I was just overthinking it, letting my insecurities get the better of me, but the truth is, over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the occasional favoritism. It was a constant thread running through every stage of our lives, like a script that was never meant to include me in a starring role. Looking back, I don't know if I could have changed anything. Maybe if I had spoken up earlier, things would have been different, but then again, maybe it wouldn't have mattered at all. As kids, Emily and I probably looked like your typical siblings from the outside. We fought over the remote, built pillow forts, and shared secrets now and then. But even then, there was a glaring difference in how we were treated. For my 8th birthday, I got a modest cake from the grocery store and a set of second-hand toys that barely worked. 2 months later, Emily had her 6th birthday, and my parents threw her what could only be described as a backyard carnival. They hired a clown, rented ponies for rides, and set up a whole face painting station. I remember sitting in the corner, holding my slice of cake, and realizing for the first time that it wasn't just about the party. It was about what the party represented. School only made the divide more apparent. When Emily struggled with a subject, my parents would move mountains to get her the best tutors money could buy. When I needed help, they'd brush it off with something like, "You're so smart, you'll figure it out." I think they genuinely thought they were complimenting me, but all it did was leave me feeling like my struggles weren't worth their time. The final straw during my school years came when I won a regional academic competition. It was a huge deal. Trophies, photos in the local paper, the works. My parents promised to come, but at the last minute they bailed because Emily had a soccer game the same day. I stood on that stage, holding my trophy, and felt the weight of their absence more than the pride of winning. Then came college. I worked my butt off to get into a decent school, applying for every scholarship and grant I could find. When that wasn't enough, I relied on student loans. My parents didn't contribute a single cent, but they were there to cheer me on as I signed papers that would put me in debt for decades. Emily, on the other hand, they covered her full tuition and even bought her a brand new car when she graduated. I remember asking my mom why they couldn't spare anything for me, and she just shrugged, saying, "It's different with Emily." To this day, I still don't know what that was supposed to mean. Fast forward to adulthood. I saved every penny and bought my first home by the time I was in my late 20s. It wasn't a mansion or anything, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. Meanwhile, Emily was bouncing from one job to another, quitting every time things got even slightly difficult. She'd call my parents whenever she hit a rough patch, and they'd always bail her out. When I asked for advice during my home buying process, they barely paid attention. But not long after, they co-signed a loan for Emily to buy a house that was way out of her budget. Honestly, anyone could have seen where that was going. My wedding was another painful reminder of where I stood. I didn't expect handouts, but when my parents said they couldn't contribute because things were tight, I believed them. Then, a month later, they gave Emily $20,000 for her future wedding. She wasn't even engaged. That was the moment I started pulling away emotionally. I still loved them, but I couldn't keep pretending I didn't notice the difference in how they treated us. The family business was the last straw. My parents run a small but successful business that I've helped grow since I was a kid. I spent countless weekends there, helping out with everything from stocking shelves to managing inventory. As I got older, I even pitched ideas that helped expand the business, and many of them paid off. But when I asked about having a formal stake in the company, they laughed it off like it was a joke. Meanwhile, Emily, who had never lifted a finger for the business, was promised the entire thing in their will. The breaking point came about a year ago. Emily defaulted on her house loan after losing yet another job, and my parents called me, expecting me to help bail her out. When I refused, my dad said, "Family comes first." That sentence still echoes in my head. I hung up the phone and cried, not because of what he said, but because I finally accepted where I stood in this so-called family hierarchy. Since then, I've started therapy and focused on building a life where I don't rely on their approval. I landed a big promotion at work, started traveling, and even rediscovered hobbies I'd forgotten about. But the family drama is far from over. Emily's poor decisions have only made things worse for my parents, and it's clear the tension is about to reach a boiling point. A few weeks ago, I decided to share my story online. I just needed to vent and see if anyone else had gone through something similar. What I didn't expect was how much worse things would get after that. Update 1. Not long after I shared my story, things started spiraling out of control faster than I ever could have imagined. Emily, true to form, came up with her latest brilliant idea, a business plan she claimed would revolutionize the luxury lifestyle industry. The plan involved a subscription-based app that would supposedly give users exclusive access to high-end events, private jets, and lucrative deals. Honestly, it sounded like something you might see on a late-night infomercial, vague enough to sound impressive but hollow if you scratch the surface. Despite the red flags, she pitched it to my parents with all the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences. And of course, they ate it up. I thought they might at least hesitate, but instead, they went all in. They didn't just give her their emotional support. They drained a significant portion of their retirement fund to invest in her app. But that wasn't even the worst of it. They co-signed a massive loan for her using their house as collateral. When I found out, I couldn't stay silent. I reminded them of Emily's long history of failed ventures, her impulsive decisions, and her reckless spending habits, but they dismissed me outright. They said I was being negative, that I wasn't giving her a fair chance, and that I should be happy she was trying to build something for her future. Predictably, the entire venture imploded within 6 months. Emily had done no market research, her business plan was practically non-existent, and she squandered most of the money on flashy but utterly useless marketing stunts. She even went as far as leasing an expensive office space, something she couldn't afford beyond the first quarter. When everything fell apart, she didn't take any accountability. Instead, she blamed the economy, claiming the market wasn't ready for her vision. My parents, unbelievably, swallowed her excuses without question. As the months passed, the financial strain on my parents became painfully obvious. They stopped going out to eat, canceled a vacation they'd been planning for over a year, and started cutting back on other expenses. And yet, they still refused to hold Emily accountable. Instead, they painted her as a victim of bad luck, constantly making excuses for her failures. It was infuriating to watch. Things finally came to a head at a family gathering. Emily showed up acting like nothing had happened, laughing, eating, and even bragging about how her next idea was going to be the one that really took off. Someone casually asked her why the first one hadn't worked out, and without missing a beat, she turned to me and said, "Well, maybe if certain people had been more supportive, things would have gone differently." That hit a nerve. I stood up and laid everything out in front of everyone. I told them how I had worked hard for everything I had, never once asking for a dime from anyone, and yet I still got no recognition from my parents. Meanwhile, Emily had been handed chance after chance and still managed to blow it every single time. The room went dead silent. Emily, clearly embarrassed, stormed out, slamming the door on her way. After that, my parents started reaching out to me more often, but not for emotional support. They wanted money. My dad called one evening, casually mentioning how they were falling behind on the loan payments for their house and hinting that I should step in because family always helps family. I stayed calm and explained that I couldn't, especially considering my own financial goals. When I reminded him of how they had refused to help me during my hardest times, he quickly ended the conversation. The cracks in our family's foundation became too obvious to ignore. Even my extended family, who had always been polite but distant, started noticing. Aunts and uncles who had never been particularly vocal began speaking up. One of my aunts even called my parents out directly, pointing out how blatantly they had always favored Emily, and how they were now reaping the consequences of those decisions. Some relatives, surprisingly, started pulling me aside to share their thoughts, saying they had always felt I was treated unfairly. It was oddly validating, but it didn't change the fact that my parents were still firmly on Emily's side. Emily, of course, couldn't let things go quietly. She took to social media, posting vague, dramatic updates about how she was being sabotaged by people who were supposed to support her. She didn't name me outright, but anyone who knew us could easily connect the dots. While some of her friends left supportive comments, others began asking pointed questions about what really happened. The posts eventually fizzled out when Emily realized they weren't garnering the sympathy she had hoped for. In the meantime, I leaned heavily on therapy to help me navigate the mess. I was learning how to set boundaries without feeling guilty, though it was easier said than done. Still, I focused on my own life and refused to get pulled back into the chaos. Then, out of nowhere, an old family friend messaged me. She had seen one of Emily's posts and wanted to tell me how much she admired my independence. She mentioned that it always seemed like I had been treated unfairly. It wasn't a huge gesture, but it felt like a small victory, a moment of acknowledgement I hadn't even realized I needed. Things took another turn when Emily was forced to move back home. With her debts piling up and no steady income, she couldn't afford her rent anymore. My parents welcomed her back with open arms, but it didn't take long for tensions to escalate. Emily started asking them for more money to get back on her feet, and my parents began arguing over how much they could realistically give her. I thought the situation couldn't get any messier, but I was wrong. My parents started reaching out to me again, dropping increasingly desperate hints about their worsening financial situation. This time, they weren't just asking me to help Emily, they wanted me to step in to keep their entire household afloat. I held firm, knowing that giving in would only enable the cycle to continue. Now, with Emily back home and my parents under immense financial strain, the cracks in our family dynamic have turned into full-blown fractures. And just when I thought the situation couldn't unravel any further, I stumbled upon a family secret that has the potential to change everything.
Update 2.
Things started to fall apart in a way I could never have anticipated. I was comfortably settled back in my parents' house, keeping my distance from Emily's mess, while quietly marveling at how deeply she had managed to sink herself into this situation. Then, out of nowhere, a distant cousin reached out. We hadn't spoken in years, one of those relatives you only ever see at weddings or funerals, but he'd heard about the family drama and wanted to check in. We started catching up, and everything seemed normal until he casually mentioned the family business. Specifically, he asked if I had any idea that Emily's house had been purchased using the business as collateral. I froze. At first, I thought he must have been mistaken. Why on earth would my parents risk the family business, the foundation of their entire lives, for Emily's house? Especially when it was obvious to anyone with a pair of eyes that she couldn't even manage her own bank account, let alone a mortgage. The more we talked, the clearer it became. It started to click. Their recent financial struggles, the vague hints about needing money, the sudden tension whenever I asked how things were going, it all made sense. I did a little digging, and sure enough, the truth hit me like a freight train. The business loan Emily had defaulted on wasn't just a personal risk, it was backed by the family business. Now, because of her reckless spending and inability to manage her finances, the business itself was hanging by a thread. My parents hadn't said a single word to me about this. Not in the countless phone calls asking for help, not during their subtle comments about tough times, not even once. The betrayal stung, but the sheer stupidity of their decision stung even more. And when I confronted them during a visit, they tried to downplay the whole thing. My dad brushed it off as a calculated risk, insisting it was necessary to give Emily a fresh start. My mom, on the other hand, blamed the bank, accusing them of being unfair and predatory. The excuses were endless, but none of them acknowledged the gravity of what they'd done. It wasn't just about their retirement fund anymore. It was about the dozens of employees who depended on that business for their livelihoods, not to mention the legacy they had spent decades building. When I pressed them for answers, they deflected. They said they couldn't just abandon Emily, that she just needed a little more support to turn things around. It was infuriating to see how deeply their blind spot for her ran. This wasn't about love or support anymore. It was about enabling a pattern of destruction. The situation escalated when word of the crisis spread through the family. My aunts and uncles, who had mostly stayed out of it until now, decided enough was enough. They called for a family meeting, insisting everyone, including Emily, attend. The goal was to address the financial disaster and finally confront the favoritism that had been festering for years. Emily showed up late, as expected, reeking of alcohol and looking like she couldn't care less. While the rest of us were trying to have a serious discussion about saving the business, she sat there cracking jokes and rolling her eyes. When someone finally asked if she felt even a shred of responsibility for the mess, she actually laughed and said, "It's not my fault the business couldn't handle one loan." That was the breaking point. The room erupted. One by one, my relatives turned on her and on my parents. They pointed out how I had worked hard for everything I had, while Emily had been handed opportunity after opportunity only to throw them all away. My parents looked increasingly uncomfortable, but they still tried to defend her, claiming she just needed more time and better support. Things really hit the fan when Emily stood up, pointed at me, and accused me of being jealous. She said I had always been envious of her, that I had deliberately turned the family against her, and that her business had failed because I refused to help. The room went silent. Then my uncle, who had been quietly observing the whole time, calmly told her to sit down and take responsibility for her actions. Emily stormed out, slamming the door behind her. After the meeting, one of my uncles pulled me aside and casually mentioned something that left me speechless. Apparently, my parents had changed their will. They had decided to leave the entire family business to Emily, cutting me out completely. Hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. Not only had they gambled the business to bail her out, but now they wanted to hand it over to her entirely, despite her track record of destroying everything she touched. That was the final straw. I contacted a lawyer and formally removed myself from any legal ties to the family business. If my parents wanted to risk everything for Emily, I wasn't going to let them drag me down with them. It was a hard decision, but it was the right one. Without my involvement, the business started to crumble. Emily predictably had no clue how to manage it, and my parents were too overwhelmed trying to clean up the financial mess they had created. Employees began quitting, and longtime clients started pulling their contracts. Meanwhile, my Reddit post gained traction. Thousands of people shared their advice, thoughts, and even their own stories. It felt strange to see my personal life laid bare for strangers, but their support helped me realize I wasn't alone. A week later, I received an emotional letter from my parents. They apologized, but the letter was full of justifications and subtle guilt-tripping. It wasn't genuine. It was manipulative. They wanted me to step in and save the business, but I wasn't about to get pulled back into their chaos. As for Emily, she's been suspiciously quiet, or so I thought. A family friend recently told me she's working on another big idea, one that could have even bigger consequences for everyone involved. If history is any indication, it's not going to end well. Update 3. It did not take long for Emily to jump into her next grand scheme, and honestly, I wish I could say I was surprised. This time, it was a luxury car rental business. Yes, you read that right, a luxury car rental business. She claimed she had done exhaustive research, practically presenting herself as an industry expert. According to Emily, there was a massive market for high-end vehicles rented out for events like weddings, music videos, and weekend getaways. She pitched the idea to my parents with so much confidence you would think she already had a fleet of Ferraris and a waiting list of VIP clients ready to throw money at her. Despite the disastrous track record of her previous business ventures and the obvious financial strain my parents were under, they fell for it. Again. They used the last bit of equity in their home to co-sign another loan for her. When I found out, I was beyond furious. I sat them down and told them point blank that this was a terrible decision. Emily had proven time and again that she was not capable of managing a business, let alone one as complex and capital-intensive as this. But instead of listening to me, they accused me of being unsupportive, petty, and unwilling to let go of the past. Classic deflection. Predictably, and I mean predictably, the business imploded in record time. Emily spent most of the loan on leasing a handful of flashy cars, renting an office in an absurdly expensive downtown building, and blowing a ridiculous amount of money on over-the-top marketing gimmicks. She justified all of it by claiming it was necessary to attract the right clientele. Meanwhile, she completely neglected essentials like insurance, routine maintenance for the cars, and even hiring a proper team to handle bookings or logistics. Within 3 months, the cars were being repossessed, and Emily was left with nothing but unpaid bills, a tanking reputation, and a growing queue of angry customers demanding their money back. The fallout was catastrophic. My parents couldn't keep up with the loan payments. Since their mortgage was tied to the same equity they had used to fund Emily's business, they ended up losing the house. They had to move in with Emily, who, funnily enough, was already struggling to pay her own rent. The irony was almost too much to handle. My parents, who had bent over backward to support Emily, now had to rely on her for shelter. But that setup did not last long either. Emily had apparently been using her apartment as a makeshift storage lot for the remaining cars, which led to complaints from her neighbors about the increased noise and traffic. Her landlord caught wind of it and promptly evicted her. Suddenly, Emily and my parents were scrambling to find somewhere, anywhere to stay. Meanwhile, I had been keeping my distance. For the first time in years, I was focusing on myself. Work was going better than ever, and I had started dating someone who genuinely supported me and encouraged me to enforce healthy boundaries. It felt like a breath of fresh air. I was finally learning how to put myself first, and honestly, it was about time. That peace was short-lived. Emily called me out of the blue one day, begging me to let our parents stay with me just until they got back on their feet. I told her, very calmly but firmly, that it was not going to happen. I could not sacrifice my hard-earned stability for their poor decisions. She did not take it well. She launched into a long, emotional tirade about how I was abandoning the family and turning my back on the people who raised me. I hung up before she could finish. Not long after, my parents reached out directly. Their tone was different, less demanding, more desperate, but the request was the same. They apologized for past actions but clearly expected me to step in and rescue them financially. I stood my ground, offering emotional support and reminding them that I was there in non-financial ways, but I would not be bailing them out. Even our extended family had run out of patience with Emily by this point. My aunts and uncles, who had previously tried to mediate and offer advice, began distancing themselves from her. One uncle, who had lent her money for her first failed business, publicly declared he was done enabling her reckless behavior. With no safety net left, Emily found herself completely isolated. Then came the lawsuits. Angry customers from her failed car rental business took legal action, claiming she had misrepresented her services and left them stranded. One particularly scathing online review detailed how Emily had ruined a couple's wedding day, promising a luxury car that never arrived and leaving them scrambling for a last-minute replacement. The bad press spread like wildfire, and Emily's already fragile reputation was in tatters. As all of this unfolded, I received a short, cryptic message from my parents. "We've lost everything. Can we talk?" For a moment, I wondered if this was another ploy to guilt me into stepping in. But something about the tone felt different this time. Heavier, perhaps even resigned. Whatever they wanted to discuss, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next wasn't going to be good.
Update 4.
The message from my parents caught me completely off guard. I read it twice, then a third time, just to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. After everything that had happened between us, their request to meet in a neutral, public place felt like an olive branch, one I wasn't sure I wanted to take. Still, after some thought, I decided to hear them out. Part of me expected another round of guilt-tripping or half-hearted apologies, but another part, a quieter, more hopeful part, wondered if this time might be different. When I arrived at the cafe, I almost didn't recognize them. My parents, once so proud and stubborn, looked worn down, their faces etched with lines of regret and exhaustion. They greeted me cautiously, as if they were unsure of how much space to give. Over steaming cups of coffee, they began to speak. At first, their words came hesitantly, but as they went on, the dam broke. They didn't just apologize, they confessed. They admitted how unfairly they had treated me over the years, always favoring Emily, always excusing her behavior no matter how destructive it was. They acknowledged the damage it had done, not just to me, but to the entire family. For the first time, there were no justifications, no excuses, just raw, unfiltered regret. As much as their apology sounded sincere, I couldn't stop the skepticism creeping in. I wanted to believe them, but trust doesn't rebuild itself overnight. I stayed quiet, letting them talk, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And eventually, it did. They revealed that they had decided to sell the family business. Years of Emily's mismanagement had run it into the ground, and the mounting debts had left them with no other choice. The plan was to use the money from the sale to pay off their debts and move into a smaller, more affordable home. Then came the part I wasn't expecting. They wanted my help. Knowing my experience with the business and its clients, they asked if I would oversee the sale. I hesitated. The idea of getting dragged back into the chaos was the last thing I wanted, but at the same time I couldn't ignore the impact this would have on the employees who depended on the business. Reluctantly, I agreed, but I made it crystal clear. My involvement would end with the sale. This mess was theirs to clean up, not mine. A few days later, Emily found out about the decision, and to say she didn't take it well would be an understatement. She stormed into my parents' house, demanding an explanation, accusing them of throwing away her inheritance. She insisted the business could still succeed if they gave her just one more chance. But for the first time in as long as I could remember, my parents stood firm. They told her it was time she took responsibility for her own life and stopped expecting everyone else to clean up her messes. Emily's reaction was as predictable as it was explosive. She accused me of manipulating our parents, of plotting to take everything away from her out of spite. It was classic Emily. Blame everyone else, never herself. The sale process was just as messy as I had anticipated. Emily did everything she could to sabotage it, from spreading rumors to potential buyers to showing up unannounced at meetings, claiming she had a right to be involved. It was exhausting, but eventually, we found a buyer who saw through the drama. The final sale price wasn't great, far below what the business had been worth at its peak, but it was enough to cover my parents' most urgent debts. When the deal was finally closed, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. I had managed to help without losing myself in the chaos. My parents thanked me, and for the first time, it felt genuine. They promised this was the start of a new chapter, one where they would stop enabling Emily and focus on rebuilding their lives. I wanted to believe them. I really did. True to their word, they used the money to pay off their debts and downsized to a modest home. They even joined a local support group for families recovering from financial crises, and my dad picked up a part-time job to keep himself busy. It was strange, but for the first time in years, they seemed content. Emily, on the other hand, spiraled. Without financial backing and with no one left to bail her out, she burned through what little goodwill she had left. She bounced from one low-paying job to the next, never staying in one place for long. Eventually, she stopped showing up at family events entirely. The extended family, who had already cut her off financially, stopped reaching out altogether. In therapy, I talked about how freeing it felt to finally prioritize my own needs. For so long, I had been caught up in the dysfunction, trying to fix things that weren't mine to fix. Letting go had been one of the hardest but most rewarding decisions I'd ever made. Just when I thought the dust had finally settled, I got a notification. It was from Emily. The message was short, cryptic, and dripping with malice. "You can't hide forever. The truth about this family will come out, and everyone will see you for who you really are." I stared at the words for a long moment before closing the message. Whatever Emily was planning, I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the chaos. For now, I'm focused on moving forward. But with Emily, I know better than to think the story is over. There's always another twist waiting just around the corner. Update 5! Not long after Emily's cryptic message, everything came to light. The truth she had been keeping bottled up was finally unleashed in the most dramatic, over-the-top way possible, a lengthy, chaotic rant posted across all her social media accounts. The post was a whirlwind of accusations, self-pity, and outright fabrications. She painted me as the ultimate villain, claiming that I had orchestrated some grand scheme to ruin her life out of sheer jealousy. According to her, I had manipulated our parents into selling the family business, turned everyone against her, and stolen what was rightfully hers. It was unhinged. When I first saw it, I braced myself for the inevitable fallout. I thought, here we go again. I expected some of the extended family might side with her, or at least buy into her sob story for a while. But to my surprise, and honestly, my relief, the reaction was not what Emily had probably envisioned. Instead of garnering sympathy, the post ended up exposing just how far she had fallen. My extended family, who had spent years witnessing Emily's antics firsthand, weren't having any of it. Within hours, the comments section became a battlefield, but not in her favor. Relatives started calling her out, one after another, pointing out the countless opportunities Emily had squandered and the sacrifices our parents had made for her. They didn't hold back. A few of her old friends even chimed in, adding their own stories about Emily's tendency to play the victim and dodge accountability. One particularly brutal comment stuck with me. "Emily, at some point, you have to look in the mirror and stop blaming everyone else for your life." Ouch. She tried doubling down, posting more defensive rants and attempting to clap back at anyone who disagreed with her, but the damage was done. The more she posted, the more obvious it became to everyone that she was spiraling. Eventually, she deleted the post, and most of her social media accounts along with it. Not long after, I heard through a mutual friend that several people in Emily's circle had quietly cut ties with her. They were tired of the constant drama and her refusal to take responsibility for anything. Watching it all unfold was surreal. I don't know if vindicating is the right word, but it made me realize just how much support I actually had. For so long, I'd felt like I was fighting these battles alone. But in reality, there were so many people, family, friends, who had been quietly in my corner all along. Meanwhile, my parents were adjusting surprisingly well to their new, downsized life. They had joined a financial recovery support group, which seemed to help them process everything they had been through. My dad took a part-time job at a local hardware store, which he genuinely seemed to enjoy. My mom, who had always been the glue holding everything together, started volunteering at a community center. It gave her purpose again, and honestly, she looked happier than she had in years. To my shock, they even started attending therapy together. If you had told me a year ago that my parents would willingly go to therapy, I would have laughed in your face. But there they were, making strides in ways I never thought possible. Emily, on the other hand, continued her downward spiral. I heard she got fired from yet another job, this time for missing too many shifts and blaming her coworkers for her mistakes. She ended up moving in with a friend temporarily, but that didn't last long. Apparently, there was some blowout fight over unpaid rent, and she was kicked out. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. While Emily was busy burning every bridge in her life, mine was heading in a completely different direction. My career had been thriving ever since I set those long overdue boundaries with my family. I had landed a big promotion at work, putting me in charge of a major project that I was genuinely excited about. Around the same time, my partner proposed during a weekend getaway. It wasn't some grand, over-the-top gesture. It was simple, intimate, and perfect for us. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was surrounded by love and support that didn't come with strings attached. When we started planning the wedding, the decision not to invite Emily was an easy one. She had burned that bridge a long time ago. My parents came though, and to my surprise, they couldn't stop telling me how proud they were of me. During the reception, my dad pulled me aside. He looked me in the eye and said, "We were wrong about so many things, especially the way we treated you compared to Emily. We'll never make those mistakes again." It was one of those rare, unguarded moments that stayed with me. It didn't erase the past, but it felt like a step toward healing. A few weeks after the wedding, I got an email from Emily. It was short and vague. An apology of sorts, but not really. She admitted to some of her behavior, but still hinted that she was angry about how things had turned out. I didn't respond. Instead, I brought it up in therapy, where I reaffirmed my decision to protect my peace. I had worked too hard to build a life free from her chaos, and I wasn't about to let her drag me back into it. After that, the updates about Emily became fewer and farther between. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved out of state and was trying to start over. Part of me hopes she finds a way to turn things around, but I also know that it's not my job to fix her. It never was. Looking back on everything, I can't believe how far I've come. There was a time when I felt trapped, constantly bending over backward to earn approval or prove my worth. Now, I'm in a place where I prioritize my own needs and surround myself with people who genuinely care about me. Life isn't perfect, but it's mine, and that's more than enough.